Since the resignation of Britain's Defence Secretary last week, we've heard a lot about the heightened threat from Russia. John Healey resigned from government because he said Keir Starmer wasn't pledging enough for the military. And then a stream of military grandees all came out of the woodwork to say the government was leaving us vulnerable to Russia. Then on Tuesday, this happened. Interesting timing.
Breaking news, sailors on a Russian warship have reportedly fired warning shots at a yacht in the English Channel. The Ministry of Defence says it is investigating the incident, which happened in waters about 20 nautical miles south of the Isle of Wight.
That was plastered all across the news channels and the papers yesterday. So had Russian warships decided that after Ukraine, it was British pleasure boaters that they had in their sights? Was this just more reason why we really do have to spend 3% of national GDP on fairly useless sort of fighter jet carriers? Well, not quite. By all accounts, the Russian warship was in international waters, traveling between locations perfectly legally, and two elderly sailors just happened to get in their way. So according to accounts, it was a foggy morning. The Russian ships were firing flares to let the sailors know, the pleasure boaters know, that they should get out of the way. Apparently, they moved their direction, but only by 2 degrees, which wasn't enough for the Russians to think that they were genuinely going to not be in their way. Military sources from the UK have downplayed the incident. So after those dramatic headlines, the military were like, actually, this isn't that big a deal. And their explanation as to why we should trust the UK military, that it wasn't a big deal, I think was very interesting, very revealing. So this was in the Telegraph. Military source says, if there were more signs of dangerous or unprofessional activity, we would have capitalized on it more. We never miss an opportunity to point out that the Russians are bad. So they say, like, if the Russians were to blame here, we would have got weeks of headlines out of it because we really want more money from the government. Whether or not you think that's because they want to keep us safe or because they want to keep their friends in the military-industrial complex happy, or maybe they're part of a revolving door, different issue. But anyway, they're saying if the Russians were in the wrong, we would not have covered for them. The coupling question, though, so the elderly voters, they don't think the British deep state is giving their ordeal the significance it deserves. So they've complained to the Telegraph that the MOD, so the Ministry of Defence, have shut their story down, saying that it wasn't in fact foggy and that the Russians escalated unnecessarily. They were reported by The Sun to have said, quote, we would have fired back if we had some weapons. So the great 2026 boating battle in the English Channel can perhaps be put down to pensioners with main character syndrome. However, and this is important, that doesn't mean Britain hasn't been subjected to other hostile Russian actions. This is really interesting. The BBC have revealed that Russia was behind 2 arson attacks targeted at Keir Starmer in May last year. Ukrainian national Roman Lavrinovich, 22, and Ukrainian-born Romanian national Stanislav Karpuich, 27, were convicted by an Old Bailey jury on Monday for conspiring to carry out the attacks. The court heard that they had been recruited to commit arson by a Russian-speaking Telegram user called L Money, who promised them payment in return. A BBC investigation has revealed that the person behind the L Money account has connections high up in the Russian state. This is from the BBC. We have identified evidence suggesting that EL is a young Russian diplomat schooled in information warfare by spies and propagandists, who is close to the highest levels of power in Moscow. His name is Evgeny Lyukshin. He is 23 and the son of a senior official. Russian operatives ran their sabotage and provocation campaign remotely through social media and the messaging app Telegram. We found creating fake online far-right and Muslim groups, which were used to organize acts of vandalism in the UK and stir up division and fear. Accounts based in Russia posted lies about the motive for the arson attacks targeting Starmer, which was spread by figures such as far-right anti-Islam activist Tommy Robinson. Now, I assume those sort of rumors, which were spread by Russia. So you might have seen that these arson attacks happened last May. Obviously, they then weren't reported on very much because it was a live case. While it was a live case and it wasn't being reported on very much, there were lots of people online suggesting, why are these all very young Ukrainian men? And there were lots of widespread rumors that they were, in fact, sex workers and that Keir Starmer had been sort of involved in some scandal involving Eastern European rent boys, I suppose is how it was sort of described. And this was sort of seen as controversial and a cover-up. The BBC reporting, which seems plausible to me, is suggesting that actually some of that was literally pushed out from Russia and people close to the Russian state. Lavrinovich, the 22-year-old Ukrainian, he had been recruited, so this is how it happened, by EL or L Money, after the Russian posted in a Telegram account for young Ukrainians seeking work. So it's actually quite sad. He wanted to send back money to his dad in Ukraine. So he'd gone on this Telegram account where people are offering work. And originally he was recruited, so the young Ukrainian lad was recruited to put up posters for a fake far-right organization. And from there it escalated to setting fire to Keir Starmer's former family home, which Starmer's sister-in-law and her child were living in at the time, and they were in the house when he tried to set fire to it. So luckily the whole house didn't go up in smoke. He sort of put something which was on fire sort of at the bottom of the front door. Apparently the house filled up with smoke, but it wasn't the case, obviously, that the whole house burnt down. By all accounts, Lavrinovich had no idea about the connection to Keir Starmer. So he also told the police he didn't really know who Keir Starmer was. And evidence of this, very concrete evidence, is that after he sent his handler, so L Money, the film of the attack, so to get payment, you had to send a film of you doing the thing. L Money replied, quote, "Look, you attacked the home of a very high-ranking person in Britain. I'll send you money. You need to leave the city." So this was completely just someone being used who had no idea what they were being used for. And presumably as they were a young Ukrainian sending money back to their father in Ukraine, I think they'd posted, some sort of pro-Ukraine things about the war. They wouldn't be particularly pleased that they were doing sort of Russia's dirty work to try and spread division in Britain. BBC Panorama, so they've done a big investigation into this, actually quite an interesting show. Obviously not Panorama generally, although it is, but this particular episode. Panorama had more details on what L Money was trying to achieve.
L Money, first of all, asked him about would he be prepared to put up some posters for money. Roman Lavrinovich put up the posters here in southwest London and sent these pictures as proof. They promoted an online far-right group called Direct Action UK. Direct Action's social media is violently Islamophobic, brands Keir Starmer a traitor, promotes Tommy Robinson, and offers money for attacks on the police. It was created in the wake of riots in the summer of 2024. But it's not what it seems. Anti-racist organisation Hope Not Hate investigated Direct Action at the time.
It became quite clear to us quite quickly that at least some, if not all, at least some of this Direct Action operation was coming out of Russia. The pound sign is at the end rather than before the numbers. We found evidence that the timestamps on these were actually Russian time. It's all about a strategy of tension. It's all about increasing the divisions between communities.
So Aaron, I mean, I found this interesting because I have sort of often been quite skeptical of the arguments, sort of say, oh, Russia did Brexit, and sort of any disorder or sort of right-wing populism, it's all sort of being pushed by Russian disinformation, and it's all down to the Kremlin. I've always been sort of skeptical of those arguments. However, the fact that sort of a Russian operative, potentially quite close to the Russian state, was paying people to set fire to Keir Starmer's house, I'm kind of surprised that's not bigger news. I mean, obviously, it's not that this hasn't been covered up. It has been on BBC News or whatever, but it hasn't in any way set the news agenda. And I find that in a way surprising. I don't know what you think.
I mean, it's not bigger news because the guy is terrifically unpopular, which is in its way amusing. I mean, I don't really like to use that word when arson's involved and a child's involved, but I mean, if he was a really popular PM in his pomp, if it was Blair in 1998, I mean, I think this would be rolling news for days.
And there'd be a big rally around the flag.
Oh, yeah. I think it's actually...
It tried to set fire to the Prime Minister's house.
Yeah, it'd be like an international news story, right? Whereas now it's just kind of minor and weird because that's how people think about Keir Starmer. I'll also say a few extra things, though. I don't really trust Panorama. I don't trust Panorama. I don't trust them since John Ware and that documentary, that awful documentary, doesn't even merit the name, is Labour anti-Semitic. I don't really trust Hope Not Hate, personally, as an organisation. However, you have to be very naive if you think Russia doesn't do this kind of stuff. Or other countries. We do it to them, right? We do disinformation campaigns, we fund fake NGOs, we do the regime change, we do the colour revolutions. We've been doing it to countries in Russia's near abroad for a really long time. They would have to be really daft to not do even just something in response. That's actually your job as a security services, right? So, I think anybody who agrees with me and says, well, this is Panorama fake news. I think Panorama is crap. I literally don't trust a word that comes out of the mouth of any journalist on Panorama after that appalling documentary, right? There were others as well. There was a Panorama documentary about Momentum, which was just, was ridiculous. Whereas actually, as Labour anti-Semitic was defamatory and just the absolute dregs of journalism. But notwithstanding that, I do think you have to be very naive to think this stuff doesn't happen at an international level. And Britain's been doing it for a very long time. If you read about the Russian Civil War following the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, the japes that the British and the Italians and the French and the Germans trying to get rid of the Bolsheviks, what they were up to was extraordinary. And of course, in response, you have the Cheka and the political police, effectively. You have effectively what's called the KGB. They're doing that in response to how the great powers act and defend themselves. So, like I say, very naive if you think this isn't happening. Where I do take umbrage with this is where people say China's doing it to Britain. China doesn't really care about Britain very much. We're a long way away. We're not in their neck of the woods. We don't really have conflicting spheres of interest. Whereas actually, the Nordics, this part of the Atlantic, is actually quite important to Russia. If Russia wants to access the Atlantic Ocean, it has to either go through the English Channel or around Scotland from its Arctic sort of base of operations, maritime base of operations in Murmansk, right? So it's a very different relationship. I do kind of laugh when people think that China is obsessed with Britain, because it's not. But there is ongoing spycraft and what was called a strategy of tension there by Nick Lowell's, which is a real thing. Strategy of tension was the Italian deep state using the far right in the 1970s to discredit progressive and left-wing causes by basically undermining the foundational essentials of democracy. So all of a sudden, you start killing people, a few terrorist explosions like the Piazza Fontana bombing, right? And you blame leftists. You say, well, look, even if it's not them, we need more police.
Sort of false flags and agent provocateurs and that kind of thing.
It's all happened, right? This is not the world of Alex Jones and InfoWars. It's very real. And the great powers do it to each other all the time. We've done it in places like Georgia and Ukraine before.
Yeah, although I suppose we did in Georgia and Ukraine, I don't know the details. Did we try and, I'm sure we did in sort of the colonial era, try and spread a lot of racial tension between groups, but I don't know if we did that in Georgia and Ukraine, sort of in modern British history, if we sort of focused quite so much on the whole sort of trying to stoke racial tension. I'm not sure, maybe we have.
Britain at its pinnacle did that, yeah.
Yeah, when it was trying to sort of keep the empire together.
When it was the imperial, I've already used the acronym, I'll use it again, the imperial goat. It was very happy to use ethnic tensions. Also, by the way, in South Asia, in the British Raj.
I suppose there's two issues, though, isn't there? Because there's one, do we sort of say this is exceptional? Russia is an exceptionally nefarious actor because it is trying to do these things, which would probably be naive. And then also, I mean, the state does really need to try and not allow adversaries to successfully undermine political stability within their own borders, right? And it's difficult to see how that is done. Like social media, I often sort of, this was partly how I read Vincent Bevan's book, you know, his first one, The Jakarta Method, which was about how sort of social democratic projects were quite, which were democratic and liberal, but tried to go against sort of American imperialism. They were quite weak because there were so many access points for the CIA or for the Americans or whoever to sort of come in and spread conspiracy theories, often about the left, or spark tension. They couldn't keep that kind of thing out. And I read it as sort of an argument for sort of Stalinism in a way, or Leninism. If you're going to try and do something which will invite opposition, you need to actually have quite a lot of control of sort of political society, because if there's too many access points, it's all going to crumble. And now that seems like a question that not only is relevant to countries in the global south, but sort of social media means that anyone can undermine anyone.
Yeah.
And I do worry that, not as a morality tale, that the global north is going to be undermined by the global south or Russia, but that every society now is just incredibly vulnerable to strategies of tension, I suppose.
Yeah.
And I don't really know what the answer is.
Well, the answer is we stopped doing it, right? We stopped doing it. And
But that's not going to stop. How is that the answer? That's too easy as an answer.
No, you do need a level of coordination. There have been periods where this was the case. You say, look, we'll stop pissing about in your backyard if you stop pissing about in our backyard. And I think, look, if you look at recent examples, Georgia, I'm not a fan of the Georgian government, you know, this Georgian ultra-nationalist government, which people have been protesting against for a very long time. The central figure in it is Georgia's wealthiest person. And if you look at his wealth relative to Georgian GDP, he's much wealthier than, like, maybe not Elon Musk now because he's a trillionaire, but Bill Gates. So I'm not batting for this guy. But when they talk about, you know, the profusion of NGOs in Georgia, in Tbilisi, I mean, it's crazy. You know, 50%, if you're a liberal and you've got a graduate qualification, 50% chance you're working for an NGO. And there is truth to this, right? And if you talk about this stuff, you sound like some Orban supporter. But this stuff is genuinely mobilized. It has been mobilized for a really long time to advance perceived Western imperialist interests. And the stuff you were saying about newspapers and magazines, just crazy. The ability of NATO, really in the 50s and 60s, with the Dulles brothers, the sort of pinnacle of NATO, and the CIA, the ability, which is basically the same thing, the ability of the Western alliance led by Washington to just spread lies and propaganda was extraordinary. The amount of cutouts they had, and that's the word, cutout, of magazines and newspapers. I think even like they had a news agency, you know, photojournalist agencies, you name it, and they could just create new information, new facts, and that would be very central to regime change efforts. And some of the conspiracy theories are extraordinary. You know, I do laugh when a few years ago people said, the left, they're so conspiratorial. In Cuba, one of the conspiracy theories the CIA tried to use to get rid of Castro was that there had been the resurrection of Christ. There had been the second coming of Jesus in Cuba. But if you're laughing, Google this stuff. That's the sort of stuff the CIA used to do all the time, and it often worked.
So I agree with all of this. But again, for it not to just be sort of a morality tale, we did it and therefore we now deserve it. Like, is it not potentially one of the reasons why no government has been able to do anything in Britain for about 10 years? Because it's so easy to sort of disrupt British politics and society from so many different angles. And that's one of the reasons why the West finds itself in crisis. Not really because of Russia, but just because it's so easy to just sort of throw a grenade in the middle of public discourse and spread conspiracy theories, whatever. And I suppose the mainstream thing on both the left and the right, actually, sort of the populist left and the populist right, is to say that any clamping down on this would be sort of like the state trying to destroy freedom of speech. And actually, we need this sort of maximalist approach to anyone should be able to say anything. And I worry that without some kind of regulation, without some guidance, like, we're all going to hell.
So I don't think you should be able to own a media outlet or have equity in a media outlet if you're not a UK taxpayer resident in the UK, for starters. So you're saying about outside interests, you know, reshaping the conversation. Rupert Murdoch owns multiple newspapers in this country. He's an American national. He's, of course, born in Australia. He lived in the UK for a long time, but he's now an American national. I don't think you should be able to do that. And there's lots of other people in a similar situation. You know, I think Lord Rothermere, non-dom, although he lives in France. That's, of course, changing now because of HMRC, I think, doing good things around non-doms. That would be my first port of call because, of course, you're saying those outsiders affecting our politics, that's been happening for ages. We allowed it to happen. Some of those people were even allowed to fund political parties. I'll also add a few more things, Michael. We don't help ourselves, you know. Salman Abedi, the Manchester bomber, that wasn't because of Chinese misinformation. That wasn't because of Russian misinformation. It was because of the stupidity of MI5 and MI6, basically working at cross purposes, right? So MI6 are the people overseas. They were working with Salman Abedi and his family to help get rid of Gaddafi. So they want militant nut jobs to be going to and from the UK to fight a war in Libya. MI5 is tasked with protecting people in this country. They don't want those people coming to and from Britain, right? So you basically had two security agencies acting against one another, right? And both would say, I'm working in the British national interest. I mean, I kind of side with MI5 on this one, right? But because of how our media works, Michael, nobody has explained how central this is to the Manchester bombing. No, literally nobody. Actually, no, that's not true. That's a lie. Pete Hitchens and Peter Oborne said it in 2 articles, I think in the Sunday Telegraph and the Mail on Sunday, I think. That's a really big deal. So yes, we can talk about China and Russia, but actually how MI6 behaves and the blowback it creates for us here in the UK is probably where I'd start the conversation. Then Elon Musk. I'm more worried about, and I'm not just saying this because it probably goes down well with our audience, right? They agree because we're both on the left. But I think it's true. Elon Musk, trillionaire, owns X. He's allowing people to say the most crazy things, including incitement, including, catalyzing and basically starting riots through online discourse. I think that's a problem. That to me is a bigger problem than, this is baby stuff compared to American big tech, X, Meta, Alphabet, how central they are in our conversation, as well as, like I say, the overseas news proprietors, which is basically most of them. We were very close to the Gulf Arabs getting the Telegraph. Crazy. And by the way, that's when the likes of Andrew Neil and Fraser Nelson say, oh my goodness, no, they should be based in the UK.
I agree with you. I think Elon Musk is a bigger threat to social order in Britain than Russia. But something needs to be done about him as well.
I know, but can I say one more thing? I'm talking a lot. But, when people look at Mao, and I just had a conversation actually with the Telegraph, and Camilla Tomine was saying, do you agree with Mao and Stalin? I said, well, they did some good things. Yeah, let's talk about it. Am I an apologist for Stalin? No, Stalin, killed lots of left-wingers, right? He killed, I think, half the KPD, the Communist Party Central Committee. So I'm not some fan of Stalin. But what you said a while back, which is if you have a revolution, and which is to say you overturn the social order and you want to protect the revolution, you can't allow people to set up NGOs and newspapers and magazines and lobby groups and political parties. You can't. You can try and do it. The Chinese and Russians said no, and those are the 2 revolutions that succeeded. I don't think we're in that situation as a country. If I was in a global south country which had been occupied, right, or had been exploited viciously for a half century or something, I probably would think that. I would have been with Comrade Ho Chi Minh and Comrade Mao. It's very unrealistic to think that Russia or China could come out of those situations and the West would just be fine with it. The West declared war on the Bolsheviks.